Here we are going live once again. Another video, another content. And don't forget to click and subscribe as I drop you another post fight review of today's fights. Now, a couple of things that Anthony Joshua and Vicente Luque have in common. For one, these two guys are switching up their styles to make something a little more conducive to what they're trying to do in their future careers. Well, for one, you have Vicente Luque, who suffered a brain hemorrhage just last year. And coming back into this fight, what did he do to mitigate that? Well, instead of fighting a very exciting, compelling, brawling style of fighting in which we know Vicente Luque to be. And by the way, we sort of look at Vicente Luque as the modern Mickey Ward, the modern MMA version of Vanderlei Silva, very violent in the way that he approaches his fights, very reckless, very dangerous in a way that can be very bad for your long-term health. And you look at anybody that has had quote unquote an exciting style in their whole entire career, you look at the end of their career, it's just not really all that's cracked up to be, right? But they are the guys that we remember, such as Robbie Lawler comes to mind, Mickey Ward, I just mentioned, a whole bunch of other guys that have an exciting fighting style. Uh, Charles Crazy Horse comes to mind in that same similar aspect. Who else is a crazy brawler that we all love and appreciate? Well, how about Derek Chisora? He's sort of in that same category, and you've seen how he fought today and how he managed to somehow come off with a decision win over Gerald Washington, a guy who doesn't have as much fights as he does, not over the tooth the way that he is, but was able to somehow use his veteran savviness to get through a decision win against Gerald Washington in today's boxing match in the undercard of AJ versus Hellenius. Now, Anthony Joshua is in that same boat. You see, Anthony Joshua today had to fight very methodical, very uh technical, had to be very careful. He had to be a boxer. And in the past wasn't so much, he was more of, how do I say this, a striker who was out to finish you, right? When he struck, he was out to finish you. This time, the way that he jabbed, the way that he worked his 1-2s, a lot of it was from trying to get from one point to the next point. And that's sort of what boxing is. This is something from an MMA perspective that I think us MMA guys have to understand, because punching in MMA is way different than boxing, other than the fact that obviously you're dealing with different size gloves and things of that nature. And then just the range is sometimes a little bit different, especially when kicks are involved. So those are some things to take into consideration and to factor in, right? The way that AJ fought was exactly that, a boxer. And what is it that a boxer does in comparison to other strikers, brawlers, or non-technical people that are in the striking boxing MMA department? Well, the difference is that their entire MO is from point A to point B. Whereas with a methodical and veteran savvy boxer, what they do is something to where they set up point A to get to point D. And then somewhere between the B and the C, there's all these different motions and all these different steps that they do in order to get to that point D. And from point D, then comes F, and then so on and so forth. So this is what veteran savvy, technical, high IQ boxers do, is that they have plan A, plan B, plan C, all the way to F and all the way to the G. Whereas with the striking and the boxing version of MMA is sort of predicated on what exactly is that? It's predicated on nothing other than just sometimes sheer luck, sometimes sheer chaos, and sometimes just the simplicity of its approach that isn't as well thought out as, let's say, that of a boxer. Well, today, Anthony Joshua was criticized for not performing up to the level of, let's say, Deontay Wilder. And is it a fair comparison to make? Because you got to understand, Deontay Wilder has knockout power, but he's not the best boxer. Anthony Joshua may not be the best boxer, but he's an evolving boxer. when I mean boxer, I mean in a technical aspect because MMA people are like looking at this thinking, what are you talking about? He's not a boxer. I'm talking about the different levels of boxing, which is that there are guys that will just go out there and swing for the fences. Certainly, a regular, let's say, domestic level boxer, international boxer, will always have more of a methodical boxing style than, let's say, a regular MMA fighter who just goes and swings for the fences, doesn't really have that technical prowess or technical way of thinking into how they approach their fight, right? But nonetheless, one thing you got to understand about what AJ did was that he knows that now, after getting beat by Usyk, that there are levels to this game, right? So, can he rely on just the first round knockout power? Well, first of all, Anthony Joshua was never a one shot killer in the first place. I mean, did he knock guys out? Yes, he knocked guys out, but it was out of accumulation. And then through that accumulation, then comes the big blow out of nowhere. Whereas with Deontay Wilder, he can just hit you with one shot and then off you go. And then that'll be that. But nonetheless, one of the things that you got to learn from today's fight cards is that eventually you have to evolve your game from one reason or another. I'll tell you why. For one, obviously, you look at Luque, great win for him today, used a lot of his wrestling to get the win, just like a Cub Swanson in the co-main event, and how he was going to deal with Hakeem Dawodu. By the way, Hakeem Dawodu is a former Canadian Muay Thai champion, so he's got great striking prowess under his belt. But Cub Swanson is more of the veteran mixed martial artist, in which, yes, he did trade strikes with Hakeem Dawodu, but within all that, he also was able to mix in some of his takedowns to get the win. And that's just what we saw tonight. So, once again, when you're a veteran in this game, whether it's boxing or MMA, eventually one of the things that you have to do is you have to go out and evolve the game from one place to another. Right? Now, Joshua was able to knock guys out earlier in his career. Now that he moved up in competition, he decided and realized that he had to do a little bit more than that. Now, with this Hellenius fight, is it possible that perhaps maybe he could have gone possum, meaning that like he could have finished him way earlier than what he should have intended or what he could have done in the current result that he was in? But maybe he just decided to get more rounds in. There are guys that do that. There's stories of Khabib letting the rounds go with the Al Iaquinta fight. For the boxing people that don't know the Al Iaquinta fight, let me remind you that that was the fight event that Conor McGregor threw a dolly in the bus, in which, in that same week, Tony Ferguson, who was one of Khabib's biggest rivals, in which he never got to fight, okay, got injured or got pulled out of the fight. And so they had to bring some people in. They tried to bring in Anthony Pettis. They tried to bring in Max Holloway, who, by the way, had the same type of brain injury that, let's say, what's his name had, Luque. So the New York State Athletic Commission wouldn't clear him. So then they bring in Al Iaquinta. Now, who's Al Iaquinta? Nobody that Khabib really hates or has a vendetta with. So he had no motivation in trying to finish him. Now, you also got to remember, this was also the time when Conor McGregor got stripped of the 155 belt. And when he got stripped of that belt, they needed to go out and have this fight for the title, the vacated title, between somebody, whether it was going to be Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, or whether it was going to be Khabib versus Max Holloway, who was the 145 champion at the time, or whether it was going to be Anthony Pettis, who, by the way, the New York State Athletic Commission said that wasn't a feasible fight because guess what? The guy was not high ranked enough to fight Khabib, which is crazy to think, right? Because obviously, you know that the commissions in boxing is not like it is in MMA, because the rankings in the UFC is predicated on the owners and the matchmakers of the UFC, not necessarily a sanctioning body that is a third party that oversees all actions. But nonetheless, they didn't want Anthony Pettis. They didn't want Holloway. They didn't want any of these guys. And McGregor vacated the belt after the Mayweather fight. And the UFC was just like, all right, we've had it. You know what? We got to have this fight play out. Now, Khabib knows that if he was going to beat Ali Quenta for the title and never fought Conor McGregor, that they would look at him as a paper champion because he didn't beat the lineal champion. Because remember, at the 155 division at this time, McGregor was the champion, okay, who had to vacate because of his time that he had to take away from the Floyd fight. Well, nonetheless, now you're in this fight with Ale Quenta. Khabib was playing possum in and of himself because some say that, you know what, if he wanted to get McGregor interested in this fight, he had to show some kind of vulnerability. So, what was the best way to do it? Go to a decision, which is why Khabib called him a decision machine leading up to the fight, while also forgetting, by the way, that he finished Michael Johnson and the likes of others before him. But nonetheless, that right there is why Khabib had to do what he had to do. He had to attract um Khabib into this. I'm sorry, Khabib had to attract McGregor into this fight. Could you say Anthony Joshua's doing the same thing? That's a great possibility, considering that he has to motivate Wilder into thinking, you know what, I can go in there and beat this guy. He did 7 rounds. I did 1 round on the same guy. He had some troubles with it. And by the way, AJ got busted up during this fight. And by the way, speaking of McGregor, how about McGregor giving him his stout beer, in which sponsored the entire matchroom call today? Right, right after Anthony Joshua got a KO, he walked outside of the cage, or I'm sorry, the ring, gave everybody daps, and I believe Conor McGregor got into it with KSI because, as you know, KSI is the business partner of Logan Paul, and Logan Paul is fighting none other than the other Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach of Conor McGregor, which is Dylan Dennis. So I thought that was really interesting that that was part of the whole ordeal, having Conor there, and then KSI was there. People were booing KSI. There was one guy in the crowd yelling at him saying, "Oh, yo, you know what? Tommy's going to hurt you," or this and that. And it was quite entertaining in that aspect, right? And by the way, being that this was an Anthony Joshua fight, it didn't seem at first, it didn't seem as big as it was in the beginning of the week, and maybe even the week prior to that. But as this fight week went on, I was like, man, you know what? He's fighting Robert Helenius, not really the biggest name, and then we saw him get slept by Wilder in the first round. But either way, still feels like a very big card. It had this big fight feel to it. And then they had the weigh in Westfield Mall in London. They had all these different interviews with different guys that were in the arena. The Matchroom production was on deck. They had all these different podcasts they were doing around the fights. They had all these different media outlets. So it was a really, really interesting fight card in and of itself. Now, with that said, I want you guys to write on the comments below if you think that Anthony Joshua is switching up his style to get ready for the biggest challenges there are out there, including Alexander Usyk. Now, obviously, he wants to get back up there. Alexander Usyk has his mandatory with Daniel Dubois and things of that nature. But nonetheless, I mean, like, this is what you got to do, right? You a couple of losses from a top guy like that, and then you have this knockout loss from Andy Ruiz, and then you had to come back and find out how to beat him through a decision. And all these losses you've had in your career, while people are deeming you as his golden child, having all these big stadium events. And by the way, how about that, right? Obviously, not a typical Anthony Joshua card, considering that most Anthony Joshua cards that I remember from the 2016, 17, 18s, and 19s, and so on were usually big stadium fights. But nonetheless, what we got tonight was what we got tonight. It was almost like Anthony Joshua going back to his European level days or his domestic level days, just like what he did when he fought Dylan White in the O2 Arena when Stormzy came out and walked out Anthony Joshua with the song Shut Up, in which, by the way, Stormzy got into it with Dylan White's crew, and that had a little fiasco in itself going on. But nonetheless, I think boxing obviously has the better cards in the current landscape right now, right? I mean, obviously, what the UFC has going on right now is all these fill-in matchups that they have to do because they have an ESPN deal, and within that deal, they have to fulfill a certain amount of cards. And in order to fulfill that certain amount of cards, guess what you have to do? You have to have a bigger roster. And sometimes, if you have to have a bigger roster, a part of that is just having to fill in these cards with all these different people. Now, okay, take this one fight, for example, with Terrence McKinney and Mike Breeden, right? Shout out to Terrence McKinney for getting this first round knockout that he did. Now, we all know Terrence McKinney's got a great story, right? He's got that great Joe Rogan post fight interview from one of his fights. He's famous for almost dying or something like that, or something happened to him. And so he became like this social media star in and of itself. But then he kind of had these tough losses along the way. Nonetheless, he's a name. But then this guy that he fought, Mike Breeden, who is he? Nobody really knows who he is. I mean, I know who he is, obviously, because I'm a hardcore fan. I watch a lot of these guys on the come up. I see a lot of their fights in the regional scenes. So, yes, as a hardcore fan, I knew who they are. But let me just go into the mind of a casual right now. You don't know who they are, but you do know who the UFC is. And when you see them fight in the UFC, guess what? It's not so much that you're watching the individual, but rather you're watching the product and the platform of the UFC. Whereas tonight, what you saw with Anthony Joshua, what you saw was, I would say, a bit of a half breed, right? A half breed of, let's say, one man promotion, meaning that it's a promotion where the entire card is revolved around man. Yes, that's all true. But then on the other side of that, you also got to think, you look at what was on the card, right? You had Hergovich taking on, um, let's see here. Let's take a look at the Anthony Joshua Hellenius card in Tapology. Let me tap in Tapology right here. Right? It was a big card nonetheless. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that most boxing cards are all about the individual, okay? But the way that Matchroom is extending their product, it's more of like building stars from the bottom of the card, and then also uplifting veterans such as Derek Chisora with his win with Gerald Washington, Philip Hergovich defeating Dempsey McKean. A lot of people didn't know who McKean was. And by the way, he made a great showing of himself up until he got finished in the 12th and final round, right? Johnny Fisher defeats Harry Armstrong, Campbell Hatton taking on Tom Ansel. Um, let's see who else was in this card. You had M. Courtney taking on Gemma Rug, Brandon Scott, Lewis Norman, and then you had Gerard Lillard defeating Bass Ostagle. I don't even want to try to pronounce his name. So a few point decision wins in that, and then you had two finishes in the main card, and then three, obviously the third one being with Anthony Joshua and Robert Hellenius. So obviously there's a lot of names in that card that they're trying to build up, but also a lot of veterans and also a big name that they headline, which is Anthony Joshua. And it doesn't surprise me because guess what? What does Matchroom try to do in relation to the UFC? They want to emulate the UFC because Eddie Hearn, I'll just say this right now, is the Tony Blair for Dana Bush White in terms of their special relations that they have in the combat sports world, right? Because if you remember in the War on Terror era, George Bush and Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of England at the time, was exactly that. They had a special relationship going on. They did what the US did. They shared intelligence together. They shared an economic powerhouse together. So they did things together. And the UFC and Matchroom Boxing, I think, have that same relationship. I mean, you take a look at Billy Joe Saunders when he fought Canelo. He went and trained at the PI Center. Hatton, I remember, even trained at a UFC gym before they had the PI, and that was back in the Floyd Mayweather days. But yeah, nonetheless, that wasn't with Eddie Hearn or anything like that. But you get the point that I'm trying to make. There's a special relationship going on there. Eddie is influenced by the UFC. And speaking of the UFC, by the way, there is only one time where I've seen an entire UFC card canceled because there was one guy in the main event that didn't want to fight, and that was with John Jones taking on a short notice fight with none other than Chael Sonnen. So he said, no, I'm not going to do that, and they canceled the entire card altogether because John Jones did not want to fight Chael Sonnen because he thought that Chael Sonnen was a risk. It wasn't somebody that he had trained for. But shout outs to Eddie Hearn. He did exactly that tonight. He did exactly that in terms of what the UFC does if, let's say, a main event falls out. Remember what I told you about Khabib and Tony Ferguson? What happened? They had three different opponents lined up for Khabib, and one couldn't pass commissions testing. One wasn't eligible. One had issues with their health and this and that. And then they had one guy that they had to pull out from the number 11 rank, which was L.A. Aquenta. Nonetheless, the show goes on, and that's literally what happened tonight. But make no mistake, I think one of the things that you can take away from tonight is the fact that Anthony Joshua had to switch up his style in order to deal with higher levels of boxing. And then on top of that, Vicente Luque, he had to switch up his style due to the health that he had going on. And then how about Khalil Roundtree getting a first round knockout against Chris Dawkins? Khalil Roundtree's dad was a former manager for Boys to Men, and then Khalil Roundtree ended up growing up as emo metalhead guy for what that's worth. And then he goes and knocks out the policeman of the Philadelphia Police Department, Chris Dawkins, right? And I jokingly said on my social media, Khalil Roundtree did something that a lot of brothers in America wish they would do, but nonetheless, that's neither here or there. I just thought it was funny bringing that up. Islam Lucendo gets a submission win over the popular Paula Vienna. AJ Dobson gets a decision over Tafon. Josh Friend gets a decision over Jamie Pickett in the beginning of the main card. And then on the prelims, you had JP Buys getting a lackluster TKO in which he got rocked. It looks like he was going to try to shoot for a single leg, but then the referee had stopped him, and it was just a really heartbreaking loss for JP Buys. You guys know about the relationship he's had with Cheyenne, right? You know, so obviously they had broken up. He was living in the United States, was an immigrant, didn't have anything. And then all these things are going on in his life. It's crazy, right? But that's combat sports for you. You know, there's no main character in this particular story or anything like that. It's just the way that it is. Sometimes sad endings happen for these guys, and unfortunately, JP Buys is an example of that. But kudos to Marcus McGee for the TKO win he had tonight in the bantamweight division. Francis Marshall of Jersey City gets a TKO loss against Isaac Delarian. And Martin Bidet gets a first round submission over Josh Parisian. Jacqueline Amuran gets a third round TKO against Musrat Ruiz. And Damon Blackshear gets a submission over Jose Johnson in the beginning of the night. And then you had Juliana Miller taking on Luana Santos. Santos gets a first round knockout in that. So quite an interesting card, right? From the main cards. And then from the main cards, from the prelims, it was very interesting with all the finishes they had. And then from the main cards, it just seemed, a bit lackluster until the knockout with Khalil Roundtree. But that was the fights of tonight. That was the story of what we had going on with AJ and Luque in terms of the styles that they had to switch. Hope you guys enjoyed the fights. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Later.